Napoleon Bonaparte once ruled Europe with fear, but in the final 72 hours of his life, trapped on a lonely island in the middle of the Atlantic, the world's most powerful emperor became a broken man haunted by betrayal, poison rumors, and terrifying visions of death. What really happened inside that dark room before Napoleon took his final breath? The truth is more disturbing than history books ever revealed. The winds over the remote island of Saint Helena howled like ghosts across the cliffs as Napoleon Bonaparte faced the final days of his life. Once feared by kings and armies across Europe, the former emperor now lived as a prisoner under British surveillance in a damp and isolated residence called Longwood House. The room smelled of mold, wet wood, and sickness. Rain constantly battered the windows while thick fog rolled over the hills like a funeral shroud. For years, Napoleon had complained about the island's miserable conditions, believing the British were slowly killing him. By May 1821, his health had collapsed completely. His stomach burned with unbearable pain, his body weakened by fever and exhaustion. The man who once rode fearlessly into battle could barely rise from bed. Servants whispered nervously in their hallways while loyal followers watched helplessly as the emperor drifted between moments of lucidity and terrifying delirium. Some claimed he muttered battle commands in his sleep, reliving old victories as though he were still standing at Waterloo or Austerlitz. Others believed he feared assassination. Rumors spread through the island that Napoleon suspected poison in his food and wine. The atmosphere inside Longwood House became suffocating with paranoia and dread. Candles flickered late into the night as doctors argued over treatments while rain hammered the roof above them. Outside, British guards patrolled constantly, ensuring the former ruler of Europe would never escape again. But no prison walls could stop death itself from approaching. In these final 72 hours, Napoleon's mind wandered through memories of glory, betrayal, war, and regret. The emperor who once shaped history was now confronting the terrifying reality that even legends die alone. The silence of Saint Helena became heavier with every passing hour, and everyone around him understood they were witnessing the end of one of the most feared and powerful men the world had ever known. As Napoleon's condition worsened, Longwood House transformed into a place of tension and mourning. The emperor suffered violent stomach cramps that left him screaming in agony, clutching his abdomen while sweat soaked his sheets. His physicians believed he had stomach cancer, the same illness that had killed his father, but others were convinced something more sinister was happening. Napoleon himself often accused the British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, of orchestrating a slow execution through poison and psychological torment. Whether true or not, the suspicion poisoned every interaction inside the house. Meals became moments of anxiety. Wine glasses were inspected carefully. Servants feared blame if the emperor became worse after eating. During his final days, Napoleon barely consumed anything except watered wine, broth, and crushed fruit. Witnesses later described his face as pale and swollen, his once sharp eyes now sunken into dark shadows. Yet despite the physical collapse of his body, flashes of the old emperor still emerged. At times he demanded military reports, asking about France as though he still ruled the nation. He spoke of his son, the King of Rome, hoping the boy might someday restore the Bonaparte dynasty. Then suddenly he would sink back into despair, convinced history had abandoned him forever. The sound of the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the cliffs echoed through the nights while candles burned beside his bed. Loyal followers remained close, terrified that each breath could be his last. Some prayed quietly while others recorded his words, understanding future generations would obsess over every detail of Napoleon's death. Even the British guards stationed outside felt the strange weight of history surrounding Longwood House. They were guarding not merely a prisoner but a fallen titan whose name had shaken the entire world. And now, as darkness closed around him, Napoleon Bonaparte appeared trapped between reality and memory, wandering through the ruins of an empire that no longer existed. The second day before his death brought even darker signs that the end was near. Napoleon drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking fragmented sentences about war, France, and betrayal. His attendants leaned close to catch his fading words. Sometimes he believed he was back on campaign with his armies marching across Europe. He whispered names from the past: Josephine, Ney, Murat, Wellington, ghosts from a lifetime of ambition and destruction. At moments he seemed terrified, staring into empty corners of the room as though unseen figures waited there in silence. His doctors applied strange treatments common for the era, including hot compresses and dangerous medicines that likely worsened his suffering. The emperor's stomach became severely swollen, and he struggled even to sip water. Yet his mind still burned with obsession over legacy. Napoleon knew history would judge him long after death, and he desperately wanted control over the narrative. He ordered revisions to his memoirs and dictated political thoughts whenever strength allowed. Those near his bed realized he was fighting not just for life but for immortality itself. Outside, storms gathered over Saint Helena, turning the skies black and violent. Thunder rolled across the island while wind rattled Longwood House through the night. Many later described the weather as symbolic, as though nature itself mourned or feared the approaching death of Napoleon Bonaparte. British officers exchanged uneasy conversations, aware the emperor's death would become a global event. Some hated him for the wars that devastated Europe, while others secretly admired the brilliance that had transformed a young Corsican officer into ruler of an empire. Meanwhile, inside the dimly lit bedroom, Napoleon's breathing became slower and more irregular. The once unstoppable conqueror now depended entirely on others even to sit upright. Every passing hour felt heavy with inevitability. His followers watched helplessly as the greatest military genius of the age slowly disappeared into weakness, fever, and shadow. During the final night before his death, Napoleon reportedly experienced terrifying hallucinations that shocked everyone around him. Witnesses claimed he suddenly raised himself from bed and shouted military commands into the darkness, as though invisible armies surrounded him once again. His voice, though weak, carried flashes of the authority that once commanded millions of soldiers across Europe. He spoke about cavalry charges, artillery positions, and battlefield movements with alarming intensity. Some attendants believed he was reliving his greatest victories, trapped in memories that refused to release him. Others feared he was haunted by guilt over the countless deaths caused by his wars. The room itself felt suffocating. Candles cast long shadows against the walls while rain hammered relentlessly outside. Napoleon's body trembled with fever, his breathing harsh and uneven. Doctors admitted privately there was little hope left. Still, they continued administering treatments in desperation. Loyal followers remained beside him through the night, unwilling to leave the emperor alone in his final struggle. One servant later described the atmosphere as a palace of death. Even simple sounds, footsteps, coughing, the crackling of candles, seemed amplified by fear. Napoleon occasionally muttered in Italian and French, slipping between languages as his mind drifted deeper into delirium. At one point he allegedly whispered, "France, Army, Josephine," before collapsing back onto his pillow. These became some of the most famous final words ever recorded in history. Yet despite the tragedy unfolding inside Longwood House, tension with the British authorities continued. Napoleon's followers remained suspicious of the governor and accused him of cruelty even in the emperor's final hours. Guards still surrounded the property, ensuring the prisoner emperor could never escape exile alive. It was a cruel ending for a man who once stood at the center of Europe's destiny. The silence between storms grew heavier as dawn approached, and everyone in the room understood that history itself was about to change forever. On the morning of May 5, 1821, the atmosphere inside Longwood House became eerily still. Napoleon had grown too weak to speak clearly, and his breathing came in shallow, painful gasps. His loyal companions gathered silently around the bed, watching every movement with dread. The emperor's face appeared almost unrecognizable compared to the commanding figure who once dominated Europe. Illness had hollowed his features, and years of stress, exile, and isolation had destroyed much of his physical strength. Yet there remained something haunting in his expression, a stubborn intensity that refused to disappear completely. Outside the windows, thick grey clouds covered Saint Helena while the Atlantic winds screamed across the cliffs. It felt as though the entire island waited in silence for the inevitable moment. Priests entered the room to perform religious rites while servants wept quietly nearby. Napoleon drifted between unconsciousness and brief moments of awareness. During one final period of clarity, he reportedly asked for news of France and spoke again about his son. Then the pain returned with brutal force. Witnesses later described how the emperor clenched the sheets as waves of agony consumed him. His doctors could do little except watch helplessly. By afternoon, the room had become unbearably tense. Every sound seemed magnified: the ticking of clocks, the crackling of candles, the distant roar of the ocean below the cliffs. Then, at approximately 5:49 p.m., Napoleon Bonaparte took his final breath. Silence filled the room. One of the most powerful men in human history was dead. For several moments nobody moved. Even hardened soldiers reportedly cried openly. Outside, British guards received the news with stunned disbelief. Though defeated and imprisoned, Napoleon's death marked the end of an era that had reshaped Europe forever. The emperor who once crowned himself ruler of France had died thousands of miles away from home, trapped on a lonely island in the middle of the ocean. The moments immediately following Napoleon's death were filled with confusion, grief, and fear. His followers rushed to preserve everything connected to him, understanding the world would soon demand details about the emperor's final hours. Locks of his hair were cut as keepsakes, death masks were prepared, and notes were written frantically by witnesses desperate to capture history before memories faded. Some attendants cried uncontrollably beside the bed, while others stood frozen in shock. The atmosphere inside Longwood House became almost sacred, as though everyone realized they had witnessed the fall of a legend. Yet even in death, controversy surrounded Napoleon. British officials quickly moved to secure the property and monitor communications leaving Saint Helena. Rumors spread immediately that the emperor had been poisoned. Years later, traces of arsenic found in samples of Napoleon's hair fueled conspiracy theories claiming the British murdered him slowly over time. Historians still debate the truth today. Was it cancer, poison, or the terrible conditions of exile that destroyed him? The mystery only deepened the legend surrounding his death. Meanwhile, preparations for the autopsy began almost immediately. Doctors examined Napoleon's body carefully while observers recorded every detail. The examination reportedly revealed severe stomach damage consistent with cancer, yet suspicions never disappeared entirely. Outside Longwood House, soldiers and island residents gathered quietly, aware they were living through a historic moment. Some feared political chaos in Europe if news of Napoleon's death triggered unrest among his supporters. Others simply felt fascinated by the strange downfall of a man who once seemed unstoppable. Inside the dimly lit room, the emperor's body rested beneath military decorations and candles. His face, according to witnesses, appeared strangely peaceful after death, as though the suffering of exile had finally ended. But the questions surrounding his final days would survive long after his body was buried. Napoleon Bonaparte was gone, yet his shadow over history had only grown larger. Napoleon's funeral on Saint Helena became one of the strangest ceremonies in modern history. The man who once marched triumphantly through Europe with massive armies was buried quietly on a remote island far from France, surrounded not by cheering crowds but by British soldiers and a small group of loyal followers. Rain clouds hung low over the valley chosen for his grave, and the atmosphere felt cold and mournful. Thousands of miles away, Europe reacted with shock as news of the emperor's death spread across newspapers and royal courts. For some rulers, it was a moment of relief. Napoleon had been the architect of endless wars that shattered kingdoms and redrew borders. But for others, especially veterans and ordinary citizens in France, his death marked the tragic end of a dream. During the funeral procession, Napoleon's coffin was carried slowly through the rugged terrain of Saint Helena while military honors echoed across the hills. Witnesses described eerie silence among those present. Even British officers reportedly removed their hats with deep respect. The emperor's body was buried in multiple coffins layered inside one another, tin, mahogany, lead, and ebony, as though everyone feared time itself might try to erase him. Yet Napoleon's followers insisted history never would. They believed future generations would remember him not as a prisoner but as a genius betrayed by enemies and fate. The grave itself remained unmarked with his name because political disputes erupted over how he should be identified. Was he Napoleon Bonaparte or Emperor Napoleon? Even in death, arguments over his legacy continued fiercely. As rain fell across the island cemetery, the story of Napoleon transformed from political reality into myth. His life became the subject of obsession, conspiracy, admiration, and fear. The lonely exile who died on Saint Helena would eventually become immortal in history books, films, paintings, and legends around the world. In the years after Napoleon's death, countless theories emerged about what truly happened during those final 72 hours. Some historians insisted the emperor died naturally from advanced stomach cancer, supported by medical evidence from the autopsy. Others argued he was deliberately poisoned with arsenic over a long period of time. Supporters of the poisoning theory pointed to Napoleon's constant paranoia about his food and wine, as well as chemical traces later discovered in preserved hair samples. The mystery fascinated generations because it transformed an already dramatic death into something even darker. If Napoleon had truly been murdered, then the final chapter of his life became not just tragic but sinister. Conspiracy theories accused British officials, servants, and even members of Napoleon's inner circle. Every detail from Longwood House was analyzed endlessly by historians and investigators. Yet perhaps the greatest mystery was psychological rather than physical. What did Napoleon truly think as death approached? Did he regret the wars that killed millions? Did he still believe destiny had chosen him for greatness? Or did exile finally destroy the illusion of invincibility he carried for so long? Witnesses described moments of pride mixed with despair. 1 hour he spoke like an emperor planning campaigns, the next he appeared broken and defeated. The isolation of Saint Helena likely intensified every fear and memory inside his mind. Cut off from France and surrounded by enemies, Napoleon spent years reliving the collapse of his empire over and over again. By the end, reality and memory blurred together. The emperor seemed trapped between past glory and present suffering, unable to fully accept that his reign had ended forever. This psychological torment may have been more painful than the illness consuming his body. Even today, historians continue debating not only how Napoleon died but who he truly became during those final haunting days on St. Helena. Napoleon's final 72 hours revealed a side of him rarely shown in history books, not the fearless conqueror or brilliant strategist, but a lonely human being terrified of mortality. Throughout his life, Napoleon cultivated the image of destiny itself, convincing millions that he was unstoppable. Yet exile stripped away the armies, the palaces, and the political power that once defined him. Inside Longwood House, facing death in isolation, he became vulnerable in ways few could have imagined. Witnesses described how deeply he missed France, especially during his final illness. He often spoke about Paris, his military victories, and the son he would never see again. The emotional pain of exile seemed to consume him just as much as physical sickness. For a man who once controlled empires, dependence on servants and doctors must have felt humiliating. And perhaps that is why his last days remain so haunting. They exposed the terrifying truth that even the most powerful figures in history cannot escape fear, regret, and death. The emperor who once shaped Europe's destiny died powerless on a distant island under guard. Yet paradoxically, this tragic ending made his legend even stronger. Napoleon's downfall became a story of ambition, betrayal, resilience, and human fragility all at once. Artists painted dramatic scenes of his deathbed while writers transformed Saint Helena into a symbol of isolation and lost glory. His enemies hoped exile would erase him from history, but instead it immortalized him. The image of the fallen emperor staring out across the Atlantic Ocean became one of history's most unforgettable symbols. And those final 72 hours, filled with storms, paranoia, hallucinations, pain, and fading memories, continue to fascinate people more than 2 centuries later because they reveal the terrifying cost of absolute ambition. Today, Napoleon's final days on St. Helena remain one of history's most chilling endings. Tourists visiting the island still walk through the silent rooms of Longwood House where the emperor spent his last hours surrounded by fear, sickness, and memories of lost power. The creaking floors, narrow hallways, and damp walls seem frozen in time, preserving the atmosphere of those haunting final nights. Historians continue examining medical reports, eyewitness accounts, and conspiracy theories, searching for answers that may never fully emerge. But perhaps the enduring power of Napoleon's death lies not in the mystery of poison or illness, but in the dramatic collapse of a man who once seemed larger than life itself. His story is a warning about ambition without limits, how the pursuit of power can elevate someone to unimaginable heights before casting them into devastating isolation. In the end, Napoleon died far from the crowds that once worshipped him, far from the battlefields that made him famous, and far from the empire he fought so desperately to control. The Atlantic winds of Saint Helena became the final sound heard by a man who once commanded the fate of nations. Yet death did not silence him. More than 200 years later, Napoleon Bonaparte still dominates books, documentaries, films, and debates around the world. His final 72 hours continue haunting history because they force us to confront a terrifying truth: no empire lasts forever, no ruler escapes mortality, and no amount of power can prevent the loneliness waiting at the end. On that storm-covered island in 1821, the emperor who once shook the world discovered the one enemy he could never defeat: time itself.